It was the third double shift of the week for Amelia Hart, a nurse at Mercy View Hospital. With her wavy auburn hair pinned neatly under her cap, and a determined look in her hazel eyes, she moved briskly between rooms, attending to her patients with the care and warmth she was known for. The workload was heavy, as usual, but Amelia never let it show. She had always believed her job wasn't just about healing bodies, it was about tending to hearts as well. Toward the end of her shift, Amelia noticed the light was still on in room 306. She glanced at the name on the clipboard and remembered it belonged to Edward Mason, a man in his late 60s who had been admitted the previous evening for chest pains. Most patients on her rounds had family or friends keeping them company, but Mr. Mason's visitor log was starkly empty. When Amelia entered the room, she saw him sitting upright in the hospital bed, staring out of the window. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his posture carried an air of loneliness. A half-eaten dinner tray sat untouched on the table beside him. "Good evening, Mr. Mason," Amelia greeted warmly. "How are you feeling?" He turned to her and managed a small smile. "I'm all right, thank you," he replied, his voice soft but steady. His polite tone felt distant, as though he were keeping an invisible wall between himself and the world. "I noticed you didn't touch much of your dinner," Amelia said gently, sitting down in the chair beside his bed. "Is something wrong with the food?" He chuckled lightly, the sound dry and brief. "It's fine, I suppose. I'm just not very hungry." Amelia studied him for a moment. His eyes, a stormy gray, held a weariness she recognized. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was the kind of fatigue that came from too much time spent alone. "You know," she began, "I make a pretty good cup of tea. How about I bring you one? It might help." He looked at her, his smile softening into something more genuine. "That would be nice, Miss Hart," she said, standing up. "But you can call me Amelia." When she returned with the tea, Amelia decided to sit with him for a few minutes. She didn't have to, of course there were charts to update and medications to distribute. But something about Edward Mason tugged at her heart. He seemed so adrift. As they talked, Amelia learned that Edward had been a widower for 10 years, and that his children lived far away. They spoke only occasionally, and his closest friends had either moved away or passed on. "I suppose I've gotten used to my own company," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Well," Amelia said with a smile, "I hope you won't mind my company while you're here. I'll make it my mission to brighten up your stay." Over the next few days, Amelia made a point to visit Edward whenever she could. She brought him books from the hospital library and asked about his favorite authors. She noticed his love for classical music and played soft symphonies from her phone during her breaks. In return, Edward shared stories from his past, a mix of adventures, mishaps, and quiet joys. Despite his reserved nature, he slowly began to open up, his guarded demeanor giving way to genuine warmth. It wasn't just small talk between them. Amelia found herself confiding in Edward too. She shared her struggles as a single mother raising an 8-year-old son named Leo, her dreams of going back to school to become a nurse practitioner, and the challenges of juggling bills on her modest salary. Edward listened intently, offering advice when he could and encouragement when she needed it. Though Amelia's days remained long and her financial worries ever present, she found herself looking forward to her time with Edward. There was something soothing about their conversations, a reminder that connections, no matter how fleeting, could bring a sense of meaning and light. For Edward, those days at Mercy View Hospital marked a change he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, he felt seen. More than that, he felt cared for. Amelia's kindness wasn't just a professional obligation, it was genuine, and it stirred something in him that he had almost forgotten, the simple joy of being connected to another person. One evening, as Amelia prepared to leave his room, Edward hesitated before speaking. "Amelia," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you. You've made this stay, well, not so lonely." Amelia smiled and patted his hand. "That's what friends are for, Mr. Mason." "Edward," he corrected with a shy smile. "Call me Edward." And so she did. The next morning, Amelia arrived at the hospital with her usual blend of energy and resolve. She balanced a tray of coffee cups and a bag of pastries, her modest splurge to share with the staff and brighten the day. Her first stop, however, was room 306. Edward had become part of her morning routine, though she'd never admit how much she looked forward to their conversations. When she entered the room, Edward was sitting up, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through a book she'd given him. His posture seemed less slouched, and there was a faint hint of color in his cheeks. "Good morning, Edward," she greeted. "I hope you're ready for some competition. I brought a crossword puzzle, and I'm determined to beat you this time." Edward lowered the book, his expression warming at the sight of her. "Good luck with that," he teased. "I've had years to perfect my crossword skills. You don't stand a chance." Amelia laughed, pulling a chair close to his bed. As they worked through the puzzle together, their banter grew livelier. Edward's sharp wit and Amelia's quick humor made the minutes fly by. But there was a comfort beyond the humor, a quiet ease that felt as natural as breathing. Over the days that followed, their bond deepened. Edward spoke more openly about his late wife, Clara, describing her as the love of his life and his greatest supporter. "She always believed in me," he said one afternoon, his voice thick with emotion, "even when I didn't believe in myself." Amelia listened attentively, her hand resting lightly on his arm as he spoke. "She sounds like an incredible woman," she said softly. "It's clear she brought out the best in you." Edward nodded, his eyes glistening. "She did. And I think she'd have liked you, Amelia. You remind me of her in some ways, kind, strong, and always thinking of others." The compliment caught Amelia off guard, and she felt her cheeks flush. "That's very kind of you to say," she murmured, humbled by his sincerity. On her breaks, Amelia began bringing small pieces of her life into their conversations. She showed Edward photos of Leo, her mischievous yet lovable son who adored dinosaurs, and had a knack for turning household objects into makeshift toys. "He's my world," she said, her eyes shining. "But being a single parent isn't easy. Some days I wonder if I'm doing enough for him." Edward listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "From what you've told me, Leo's a lucky boy to have you as his mother. You've given him love, and that's the most important thing. The rest will fall into place." His words lingered with Amelia long after their conversation ended. Despite her struggles, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just Edward's encouragement, it was the way he spoke, with a quiet authority born of experience and understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Amelia began noticing subtle changes in Edward. His appetite improved, and he started participating in physical therapy sessions with more enthusiasm. The nurses on the floor even remarked on how his spirit seemed brighter. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," one of them told Amelia. "He's like a different person." But Amelia didn't think she was doing anything extraordinary. She was simply being a friend, someone to share a laugh with, someone to remind Edward that he mattered. And in return, she found herself enriched by his wisdom and his stories. One afternoon, as a gentle rain pattered against the hospital windows, Edward surprised her by asking a question that felt heavier than the others. "Amelia, do you ever think about what really matters in life?" The question caught her off guard. "I do," she admitted. "I think about it a lot. For me, it's the people I care about, my son, my friends, my patients. They're what keep me going." Edward nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I used to think it was success," he said. "For years, I chased achievements, thinking they'd bring me happiness. But after Clara passed, I realized how empty those things were without someone to share them with." Amelia reached for his hand, her fingers curling gently around his. "It sounds like you've learned what really matters," she said. "And that's not something everyone figures out." Edward looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but it took me a long time to see it." Their conversation lingered in Amelia's mind long after her shift ended. Edward's reflections on life resonated with her, especially as she wrestled with her own dreams and challenges. She couldn't help but marvel at the way their friendship had grown. each of them giving and receiving in ways that felt deeply meaningful. What neither of them realized was that this bond would soon lead to something neither could have anticipated, an act of generosity that would change Amelia's life forever. But for now, they were simply two people finding solace and strength in each other's company, their lives intertwined in ways they never expected. By the third week of Edward's stay, his room had transformed into something of a sanctuary. The bare hospital walls now held a few small decorations, a framed photograph of Clara that his children had sent at Amelia's suggestion, a small potted plant brought in by one of Amelia's colleagues, and a stack of crossword puzzles that Amelia replenished daily. Edward's demeanor had changed too. While still reserved at times, he no longer seemed like the lonely man Amelia had first met. Their bond had grown beyond nurse and patient. Edward had become a steady presence in Amelia's life, offering advice and quiet encouragement when she shared her struggles. On one particularly busy evening, when Amelia rushed into his room looking visibly frazzled, Edward gestured for her to sit down. "You're no good to anyone if you're running on fumes," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Take a moment." "That by?" Amelia hesitated but finally relented, sinking into the chair beside his bed. "You're right," she admitted with a small laugh. "It's just, there's so much to do, and when I'm not here there's Leo, the bills, the laundry." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Sometimes it feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water." Edward studied her with a thoughtful expression. "You remind me of Clara," he said after a moment. "She was always putting others before herself. It's a beautiful quality, but it's also exhausting. You have to make time for yourself, Amelia." His words stayed with her as she finished her shift. Later that night, after tucking Leo into bed, she sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Edward's advice. It wasn't the first time he'd urged her to slow down, but this time she felt the weight of his words. She resolved to make small changes not just for herself, but for Leo, who deserved a mother who wasn't constantly overwhelmed. The following morning, Amelia returned to work with a renewed sense of determination. She brought Edward his usual cup of tea, and as they chatted, she shared her decision to take better care of herself. "It's not going to be easy," she said with a wry smile, "but I think you're right. I can't pour from an empty cup." Edward smiled, his approval evident. "I'm glad to hear it. You deserve to be happy, Amelia. You've done so much for others, it's time to do something for yourself." Their conversations continued to deepen, touching on subjects both light and serious. Edward shared memories of his childhood, his career, and the travels he had taken with Clara. "We always said we'd visit Paris," he said wistfully one afternoon. "But life had other plans." Amelia listened, captivated by his stories. She shared her own dreams as well, her hope to one day buy a small house for herself and Leo, a place where they could plant a garden and have room to breathe. "It feels so far away," she admitted. "But I'll get there. I have to." Edward nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I believe you will," he said. "You have a strength about you, Amelia. It's rare." As the days went on, Edward's health continued to improve. He began taking short walks around the ward with the help of a cane, his spirits lifted by the steady progress. Amelia cheered him on, celebrating each milestone as though it were her own victory. One afternoon, as Edward completed a particularly challenging walk, he turned to Amelia with a smile. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "You've given me more than just care, you've given me hope." Amelia felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You've done the hard work," she replied, her voice soft. "I've just been here to cheer you on." Edward shook his head. "It's more than that. You've reminded me that there's still kindness in the world, even when it feels far away." Their friendship became the talk of the hospital floor. Other staff members noticed how much brighter Edward seemed, how he laughed more freely and walked with a purpose that hadn't been there before. "You've really made a difference," one of Amelia's colleagues told her. "He's like a different person." But for Amelia, it wasn't about recognition. It was about the connection she had forged with Edward, a connection that felt like a gift in itself. She couldn't have guessed, however, that Edward was already planning a way to repay her kindness, a gesture that would leave her utterly speechless. For now, though, they continued to share their days, finding comfort and strength in the simple act of being there for one another. It was Edward's last week at Mercyview Hospital. His recovery had gone better than expected, and the doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. Though Amelia was thrilled to see him doing so well, the thought of him leaving filled her with an unexpected sadness. Over the weeks, their friendship had become a source of joy and inspiration, a reminder of the power of human connection. On Edward's final evening in the hospital, Amelia stopped by his room after her shift. She found him sitting by the window, gazing out at the city lights. He turned when she entered, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Amelia," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I was hoping you'd come by." "Of course," she said, pulling a chair close to his. "I wouldn't miss a chance to say goodbye." Edward chuckled softly. "I'm not going far," he reminded her. "Just back to my quiet little apartment. Though I'll admit, it'll be strange not having you around to keep me company." Amelia smiled, though her heart ached at the thought of their daily conversations coming to an end. "I'll miss you too," she admitted. "You've become, well, more than just a patient. You're a friend." Edward nodded, his expression softening. "The feeling is mutual. In fact, you've been one of the brightest parts of my life in a very long time. And that's why I want to do something for you." Amelia tilted her head, puzzled. "You've already done so much," she said. "Your advice, your encouragement, it means the world to me." Edward waved a hand dismissively. "That's nothing compared to what you've given me. You brought light into a very dark time, Amelia. And I've been thinking a lot about how I can show my gratitude." He paused, as though searching for the right words. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "Amelia, there's something I haven't shared with you. Something most people don't know about me. You see, I wasn't always the quiet old man you met in this hospital bed. For most of my life, I ran a successful business, a small publishing company that did quite well over the years. When I retired, I sold it for a significant sum." Amelia blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "You mean, you're wealthy?" Edward nodded, his expression calm but sincere. "Yes. I've been fortunate, financially speaking. But in recent years, that fortune has felt hollow. Without Clara, without my children nearby, money means very little. What I've come to realize, especially during my time here, is that the true wealth in life is kindness. And you, Amelia, have shown me more kindness than I could have ever hoped for." Amelia's cheeks flushed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly. "I'm glad I could help, but—" Edward raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "You've done far more than your job," he said. "You've given me friendship, comfort, and hope. And now I'd like to give something back to you." He reached for the small drawer in the bedside table and pulled out an envelope. Handing it to her, he said, "This is for you and Leo. I hope it helps make your dreams a little more attainable." Amelia hesitated, her heart pounding as she took the envelope. Inside, she found a handwritten note and a check for $10,000. She stared at it, her mind reeling. "Edward, I don't know what to say. It's too much." "It's not enough," Edward said firmly. "You've given me more than money could ever buy. Please, accept it as a token of my gratitude. And promise me you'll use it for something that brings you and Leo happiness." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she clutched the envelope to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Edward smiled, his own eyes misty. "You deserve it, Amelia. And I have no doubt you'll use it to create a brighter future for yourself and your son." That night, as Amelia walked to her car, she felt a sense of hope and possibility she hadn't experienced in years. Edward's gift wasn't just financial, it was a reminder that kindness had a way of coming full circle, bringing light to both the giver and the receiver. Neither of them could have predicted how much their lives would change because of their friendship, but they both knew one thing for certain: their bond, forged in moments of compassion and care, was a gift that would last forever. A week after Edward was discharged, Amelia found herself thinking about him often. The quiet moments at work felt emptier without his laughter, or the steady cadence of his voice recounting a story. But life carried on, and Edward's gift had already begun to change hers. She used part of the money to pay off lingering bills that had kept her awake at night, freeing her from the constant weight of financial anxiety. The rest she put aside for something she'd been dreaming about for years: a small home for her and Leo. It wasn't extravagant, just a modest house with a little yard where Leo could run and play. But for Amelia, it was a symbol of stability and hope, a chance to give her son a life filled with security and love. One crisp autumn morning, Amelia stood on the porch of her new home, watching as Leo explored the yard with unbridled enthusiasm. He was darting between trees, pretending to be a brave explorer, his laughter ringing out like music. Amelia smiled, the sound filling her with a profound sense of gratitude. It was in that moment that her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. The text read, "Amelia, it's Edward. I hope you don't mind my reaching out. I wanted to see how you and Leo are doing." Her heart leapt at the sight of his name. Without hesitation, she called him back. His voice on the other end of the line was warm and familiar, and they quickly fell into conversation. Edward asked about Leo, about the house, and about how she was managing with her newfound stability. "I don't know how to thank you, Edward," Amelia said earnestly. "You've changed our lives in ways I can't even put into words." Edward chuckled. "You already have, Amelia. You gave me more than I could ever repay. You reminded me of what it means to connect with someone, to care and be cared for. That's worth more than money." As they spoke, Edward revealed that he had been thinking of ways to stay connected to the people who had become important to him. Inspired by Amelia's warmth and compassion, he had decided to volunteer at a local community center, helping mentor young adults who were just starting out in their careers. "It's been fulfilling," he admitted. "I think Clara would be proud." Amelia smiled, her heart full. "She would be," she said. "I'm proud of you too, Edward. You've taken something difficult and turned it into something beautiful." Their friendship didn't end with Edward's discharge. They stayed in touch, exchanging messages and phone calls. Sometimes Edward would surprise them by dropping off a small gift for Leo: a puzzle, a book about dinosaurs, or a handwritten note encouraging him to chase his dreams. Other times, he and Amelia would meet for tea, sharing stories and updates about their lives. Months later, Amelia invited Edward over to see the house he had helped make possible. When he arrived, Leo greeted him at the door with the exuberance only an 8-year-old could muster. "You're the one who helped my mom, right?" Leo asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Edward chuckled, kneeling to Leo's level. "I think your mom and I helped each other," he said. Amelia watched the exchange from the doorway, her heart swelling with gratitude. Edward's presence in their lives had been an unexpected blessing, a reminder that kindness had the power to bridge even the widest gaps and bring people together in profound ways. As the three of them sat together in the cozy living room, sipping tea and laughing over one of Leo's wild stories, Amelia couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had changed. It wasn't just the financial gift Edward had given her, it was the friendship, the wisdom, and the unwavering belief in her ability to overcome life's challenges. In the end, their story wasn't about grand gestures or extraordinary circumstances. It was about the quiet power of human connection, the way a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. And as Amelia looked at Edward and Leo, two people who had become her family in different but equally meaningful ways, she knew one thing for certain: the best gifts in life were the ones that couldn't be measured, only treasured. Smiling, she raised her cup and said, "To unexpected friendships and brighter tomorrows." Edward raised his cup in return, his eyes sparkling with warmth. "To kindness," he said simply. And in that moment, surrounded by love and gratitude, they knew they had found something truly priceless.